Hi, everyone. Welcome to the third installment of Scribbles from the Basement. Today, I'm going to take on a pretty heady subject, truth and meaning. There's a whole world of philosophy, but it's something I've been thinking about for a fair amount. So let me see if I can just kind of riff on this a little bit. We live our lives over time, and we go through a series of events over time. As we move through that series of events, our kind of our lived experience since we are social animals. Let's just make these kind of critical moments. And there's lots of things you can do with your life path and your life journey and stuff. I won't get into all of that. But as we go through our lived experience, we might identify a certain number of experiences that have an arc to them, that have something. Oftentimes we'll call this a story, right? Let me tell you a story about my first job, or let me tell you a story. So here we're dealing with stories, and often those stories, when we're telling them and we share them with other people have a similar experience, and sometimes those stories even have a moral or a lesson, right? So we over time and in history, we've learned to process our shared lived experience through narrative, by telling each other stories around the campfire back in the olden days. And in pre-modern times, that's all we had in terms of, we had stories and stories, and those shared stories would elicit a moral or a lesson. And that would lead to seeing a pattern and saying, oh, we have some shared belief that emerges from those stories. Now, at a little bit of a higher level, if we want to look at the arc of narrative across life, in the West, at least, certainly we might get to something like Joseph Campbell, who kind of essentially articulated the hero's journey for the whole arc of life, not just one little story, but a hero's journey, and that there is a predictable pattern, right? And this is where the notion of myth comes from. Mythology is that there are familiar narratives on the arc of life. Now myth, I'm using this term in the colloquial sense. It's myth. Sometimes say, oh, that's untrue. Oh, that's a myth, meaning, oh, it's whatever. It has a connotation of untrue. I don't mean it in that way. I mean it very much like there is an arc that we go through: the call to adventure and the refusal of the call, and the trials and tribulations and the ordeal and all of that kind of thing. And so for millennia, we've kind of processed our experience through narrative, and then we've kind of looked for patterns in those narratives to elicit either kind of morals or lessons or beliefs, and there's a structure to those narratives, a higher order structure that becomes myth, and then we can move further up this abstraction layer to kind of get to religious beliefs and so on and so forth. I don't want to go there, but for a very, very long time, our experience was processed in that way, right? Then in the 1500s, so this is really, this was about belief derived through stories that had patterns. And it was about shared experience, right? And we would elicit lessons from those narratives to kind of help guide our behavior in our lives. Now, when we had the Enlightenment and we had the ushering in of the scientific revolution, we now had experiment. So one of these stories might have been with people saying, when I'm on the Leaning Tower of Pisa, or when I'm on the London Bridge, or when I'm on Mount Kilimanjaro and I drop a stone and a feather, they both land at the same time. Isn't that weird? Oh, wow, that's weird. I saw that too. So there's a narrative or a story about an experience, but then that experience now can be experimented with. Can we take that experiment? What are the input conditions? What's the experiment? And do we get a reproducible result that comes out of it, right? So that's about, can we kind of find a rule that kind of links cause and effect, right? And so that ushers in the scientific revolution. It ushers in the modern era, where now we're basically saying it's objective truth, reason, where we're going to use science and the scientific method to articulate the truth. So the truth up here, the truth above the line, is about narratives that convey shared experience and morals and mythologic structures that emerge from it. And the truth that emerges down here is something that can be proven, right? And similarly here, if we take these events or patterns and we try to prove them, we can say, as we do as engineers, QED, we have demonstrated that truth, okay? And similarly now, we might have a model, we might have a framework, and we might have an axiom. So just as there's kind of a hierarchy here that kind of goes this way in terms of abstracting up, there's also kind of a hierarchy down here in terms of getting to something like gravity equals 9.8 meters per second. That is true anywhere on the planet, right? F equals ma. That is true. Both of these, of course, are in a human spectrum, not in a quantum spectrum. But these are axioms. These are things that we've derived from multiple experiments that we know to be true. Now, the challenge here is, when we get to postmodern, so if we want to roughly call this world here, the pre-modern world, and we want to call this world here the modern world, right? Then postmodernism says, nope, we're anti-realism. Everything is subjective and everything's constructed based around my reality through an individual kind of lens. So that is a criticism, if you will, of the scientific method. And I'm sympathetic to that in one side, and I'm not in another. And here I'm going to reach to David Eagleman. And so David says, in our world of lived experience, let me go down here, in our world, in our whole universe of lived experience that we talked about originally, there are lots and lots of experiences that we have that we process through narrative, right? And then that we kind of synthesize through morals, myth, belief. And so there's a truth that comes through that process of shared narrative and experience, right? And that's a very, very expansive universe. Now, there are some truths that from that whole set that can be proven by the scientific method, right? So if to use the same colors, if this is the universe of all human experience, this would be like the universe of what can be proven. But the truth is, and what David says so compellingly is, it's not this big. If we're talking about that, the amount that can be proven through the scientific method, and this is probably not to scale because this little dot I have is way too big, right? So in this universe, relative to the whole universe of lived experience, there are things that can be proven by the scientific method, but there's a whole lot that can't. And just because it can't be proven by the scientific method doesn't necessarily mean that it's not true. It's just that the tools we have are not suited to proving that reality. Let me give you two examples. In the green world, I believe that my wife loves me, but I can't prove it, right? So there are certain beliefs that we have that can't necessarily be empirically proven. In the blue world, I believe that things fall from, on high to the ground. And we can not only prove that using the scientific method, we can prove it and actually quantify it when we can say that gravity equals 9.8 meters per second. So in the blue instance, this is true, and we have a law or a proof. In the green instance, it's not true according to the scientific method, not because it's not true, but because it can't be proven, because what's experienced over here is not suited to the tools that we use here. So I think there are kind of two types of truths. In the lived experience, there are things that have to be believed to be seen. And in the world that conforms, that fits within the scientific methods, we need to see them to believe them. We need to see it, and we need to believe it. And I think part of the challenge that we're facing today, not in the physical sciences, but in the social sciences, with the kind of with the replicability problem. If you look at the marshmallow experiment or a lot of these very well-known experiments, we're having problems replicating them because things in humans change over time, right? And so in one instance, we could just say, is it true or not true that delaying gratification is good for us? Well, back when the marshmallow experiment was originally conducted, it was, right? Is it true today? Maybe not. Is the fault in the fact that society and culture has changed? Is the fault in the fact that the measurement instruments in the first place weren't correct? That's the challenge. So what is truth and meaning? My take on it is very much informed by David Eagleman, that our lived experience is far, far bigger than what science can possibly prove. But we should not try to conform our life to fit within the world of the scientific method as we understand it today, because life would be super boring and very binary if that was the case. So there is my riff, if you will, on truth and meaning. And the big goal is that whatever we do, we need to be happy. Hope you enjoy that.